Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The arrest. It was the kind of day when even the air felt heavy, clinging like a second skin under the scorching sun. Marcus Davis wiped a bead of sweat from his brow as he walked along a nearly empty street in his quiet neighborhood. He was an unassuming figure, dressed in neatly pressed khakis and a blue button-up shirt, his leather satchel slung over one shoulder. The rhythmic tap of his polished shoes on the pavement was the only sound accompanying him as he moved, his mind preoccupied with the task ahead, a presentation he was set to deliver at the community center just a few blocks away. As Marcus approached the intersection, he hesitated. The nearest crosswalk was 2 blocks down, but the road in front of him was devoid of cars. A quick glance confirmed there was no immediate traffic. What harm could it do, he murmured to himself, taking a brisk step off the curb. His stride was purposeful, his intent clear: reach the other side and continue his journey. He barely made it across when the sharp wail of a police siren pierced the air, startling him. Marcus turned his head to see a police cruiser pull up sharply beside him, its tires screeching against the hot asphalt. 2 officers emerged, their presence commanding and intimidating. Sergeant Doyle, a stocky man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, strode toward him with his baton tapping rhythmically against his open palm. Beside him was Officer Carter, a younger and visibly nervous officer who seemed more interested in observing than participating. "You there?" Doyle barked, his voice gruff and accusatory. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "Crossing the street," he replied, his tone measured and polite. Doyle's expression hardened. "Crossing the street?" he repeated mockingly. "You just jaywalked. That's breaking the law. Let me see some ID." "Jaywalking?" Marcus asked incredulously, though he complied without hesitation. Reaching into his pocket, he retrieved his wallet and handed over his identification. Doyle snatched it from his hand, his eyes scanning the card with an intensity that suggested he was looking for something incriminating. A faint sneer curled his lips as he glanced back at Marcus. "Marcus Davis, huh?" Doyle muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. "Figures. You people always think you can do whatever you want." The comment hung in the air, sharp and stinging. Marcus felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I don't understand," he said evenly. "There weren't any cars, and I was careful. Surely this doesn't warrant." "Don't tell me how to do my job." Doyle snapped, his voice rising. "Hands behind your back. You're under arrest for jaywalking." The absurdity of the statement left Marcus momentarily speechless. Under arrest? For crossing the street? This feels unnecessary. "Unnecessary?" Doyle barked, his tone laced with mockery. "What's unnecessary is your attitude. Maybe a night in the precinct will teach you some respect." As Doyle reached for his handcuffs, Officer Carter hesitated. "Sarge, maybe we could just give him a warning," he suggested timidly, glancing at Marcus with a mixture of unease and sympathy. Doyle shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "Stay out of this, rookie," he growled. "If you can't handle the heat, go sit in the cruiser." Marcus, sensing the futility of arguing further, raised his hands in compliance. The cold steel of the cuffs bit into his wrists as Doyle secured them with a force that bordered on excessive. Doyle then pushed Marcus toward the cruiser, causing him to stumble slightly. A small crowd had gathered by now, their murmurs of disbelief creating a low hum of tension. A few people had their phones out, recording the scene as it unfolded. "This is outrageous," a woman in the crowd muttered, shaking her head. "Arresting a man for crossing the street? What is this world coming to?" Another bystander stepped forward, his voice firm. "Officer, is this really necessary? The man didn't do anything wrong." Doyle turned on the man with a glare. "You want to join him? Mind your business, or I'll arrest you for obstructing justice." The man held up his hands in surrender, stepping back into the crowd. Marcus, now seated in the back of the cruiser, caught the man's eye through the window and gave him a small, reassuring nod. He didn't want anyone else to get involved, not when things were already spiraling out of control. As the cruiser pulled away, the whispers of the crowd grew louder, their disbelief giving way to anger. What had started as a routine afternoon had quickly turned into a spectacle, one that would not be forgotten anytime soon. Inside the cruiser, Marcus sat silently, his mind racing. He had always been taught to respect authority, to comply even when things seemed unjust. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't just about jaywalking or even about him. It was about power and prejudice, wielded without accountability. And as the precinct loomed ahead, Marcus made a silent vow: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The cage. The cruiser's tires crunched against the gravel as it rolled to a stop in the back lot of the precinct, far from the front entrance where most citizens entered. The midday sun beat down on the yard, casting stark shadows that made the place feel like something out of a dystopian novel. Marcus sat rigid in the back seat, his hands still cuffed uncomfortably behind him. Sweat pooled at the base of his neck, the air inside the cruiser stale and suffocating. Sergeant Doyle opened the back door with an impatient yank, his face twisted into a smug grin. "Out," he barked. Marcus shifted, swinging his legs out first, before standing up straight. Doyle's hand clamped around his upper arm with unnecessary force as he guided Marcus toward the building. The back entrance was little more than a loading bay, strewn with broken equipment, cigarette butts, and a faint smell of oil. As Marcus stepped inside, he felt the sharp contrast between the blazing outdoor heat and the artificial chill of the precinct. The hallway they entered was dim, lit only by a flickering fluorescent light overhead. "What's the plan here?" Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with a subtle edge. "A citation? A night in a cell? For jaywalking?" He didn't bother hiding his incredulity. Doyle didn't answer, though Marcus caught the slight tightening of the sergeant's jaw. Instead, Doyle marched him past the holding cells and further toward an obscure section of the precinct, an area not often frequented by civilians. Officer Carter followed a few steps behind, his fidgeting hands betraying his discomfort with the situation. Sarge," Carter spoke up hesitantly, "shouldn't we process him first? Log his name, take his statement?" Doyle didn't stop walking. "This one's special," he said with a derisive snort. "He gets the back lot." "The back lot?" Carter repeated, clearly confused. "You'll see." Marcus's mind raced. The back lot? What did that even mean? He'd spent years working in human rights advocacy, enough to know the stories, the ugly, whispered incidents of abuse that rarely saw the light of day. Was this one of those moments? He steeled himself, his resolve unshaken even as unease stirred in his gut. Finally, Doyle led him out through a side door into the back lot of the precinct, a desolate space surrounded by tall chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire, his voice low with alarm. "Sarge, we can't, this isn't procedure. We can't put someone in that thing." "Procedure?" Doyle spat the word like it was poison. "You want to write a rulebook for me, rookie? Step aside, or you'll find yourself explaining to the captain why you questioned my authority." Carter's protest fell to a whisper, his shoulders slumping in defeat as he looked away. Marcus stood tall, his calm demeanor unshaken despite the grotesque spectacle before him. "You realize this is going to come back to haunt you," he said quietly, fixing Doyle with an unwavering gaze. "This won't go unnoticed." "Who's going to care?" Doyle shot back, his tone dismissive. "Some jaywalker who didn't know his place? Go on, get in." Marcus hesitated for only a second before stepping toward the cage. He wasn't about to fight or resist, that would only feed into Doyle's narrative. Instead, he walked calmly inside, his movements deliberate. Doyle slammed the cage door shut, locking it with a loud clank. The sound reverberated in the empty lot, an echo of indignity. The cage was barely tall enough for Marcus to stand upright, and its metal bars were hot from the sun. He moved cautiously, testing the stability of the floor beneath him, which was uneven and stained with rust. There was no bench, no shade, just a crude, confined space meant to humiliate. From outside the cage, Doyle stood with his arms crossed, a satisfied gleam in his eyes. "Enjoy your stay, Davis," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before breaking the law." Marcus met his gaze, calm and defiant. "This isn't about the law, and you know it," he replied. "This is about you. About your need for power." Doyle's face darkened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the building, leaving Marcus alone in the sweltering cage. Carter lingered for a moment, his expression conflicted. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it and silently followed Doyle inside. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus surveyed his surroundings. He could see parts of the street through the gaps in the fencing, where life continued as usual, cars rolling past, pedestrians oblivious to the absurdity unfolding just yards away. The sun bore down mercilessly, and sweat began to soak through his shirt. Flies buzzed lazily around him, drawn by the rusty stains on the cage floor. But Marcus refused to feel defeated. He had endured worse, years of quiet battles in courtrooms and boardrooms, fighting for human rights in a system stacked against people like him. This wasn't just about his arrest anymore, it was about the principle. He knew what Doyle was trying to do, strip him of his dignity, make him feel small. But Marcus wouldn't allow it. Dignity was something no one could take unless you surrendered it willingly. The minutes turned into hours. The sun slowly moved across the sky, casting longer shadows through the cage. At one point, Marcus heard a faint sound, someone calling his name. He turned his head sharply and spotted a young woman with a camera peering through the fence. "Hey! Sir! Are you okay?" she called, her voice concerned. Marcus squinted, shielding his eyes from the sun. "I'm fine," he replied evenly. "Who are you?" "I'm a reporter, Aaron Langford from the City Times," she said quickly. "Someone called in about a man being held in a cage. I thought it was a joke, but..." She trailed off, looking horrified. "This is real." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. "It's very real." "And what you're seeing? That's abuse of power." Erin nodded, her camera clicking as she began taking photos. "Don't worry. I'll make sure people know about this." For the first time since this ordeal began, Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. Doyle thought he was untouchable, that no one would care what happened in a forgotten corner of a precinct. But Marcus knew better. The truth had a way of getting out. Erin disappeared moments later, but her presence had been enough to reignite Marcus's resolve. He leaned back against the cage, his body aching from hours of confinement but his spirit unbroken. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Inside the precinct, Doyle sat in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee. He felt a twisted satisfaction about the day's events, convinced that Marcus would emerge from the cage, humiliated and compliant. But as he sipped, his phone buzzed. BZZZT. A notification from a local news site. The headline read, "Man held in cage by police over jaywalking, abuse of power?" Doyle's face paled as he clicked on the article. There, staring back at him, was a photo of Marcus, drenched in sweat, standing tall inside the cage, his expression calm and unwavering. Across town, the story was already spreading like wildfire. And Doyle, for the first time, felt the stirrings of doubt in his gut. The storm gathers. Marcus stood motionless in the rusted cage as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. The searing heat was finally giving way to the warm hues of evening, but relief was still far off. His throat felt parched, his shirt soaked through with sweat, yet his composure never wavered. He had always been a man of endurance, this was not his first trial, nor would it be his last. As he adjusted his stance, the faint hum of life outside the precinct grew louder. A growing crowd was starting to gather near the back fence. At first, it was just a few curious bystanders, a man with a bicycle, a couple walking their dog, but soon more people arrived, alerted by whispers of the outrageous spectacle. Erin Langford's photos and her headline had sparked a wildfire across the local news circuits and social media. From inside the precinct, Doyle was beginning to sense the storm building. Sarge?" Officer Carter hesitated as he entered the break room, his phone in hand. "You might want to see this." Doyle barely looked up, sipping his coffee. "What now?" "It's spreading," Carter said nervously, placing his phone on the table. The screen displayed a flurry of news articles and tweets. Local man held in cage for jaywalking, abuse of power caught on camera. Police misconduct allegations spark public outcry. Civil rights advocate Marcus Davis targeted by biased officers. Doyle's smirk faltered. He snatched the phone from Carter's hand, scrolling through the endless posts. Hundreds of comments flooded the articles: outrage, disbelief, demands for accountability. Videos and photos of Marcus in the cage had gone viral within hours, lighting up every corner of the internet. People were calling news stations, demanding answers, and local activists had already announced a march to the precinct the following morning. "This is bad, Sarge," Carter said softly, clearly unsettled. "People are mad. Real mad." Doyle slammed the phone onto the table, the sound echoing in the room. "It's just noise," he growled, though his voice betrayed the slightest tremor. "People get worked up about anything these days. It'll blow over." Carter's jaw tightened. "I don't think so. They know his name now. Marcus Davis, he's not some nobody. He's a federal human rights inspector." Doyle froze. "What did you just say?" "Human rights inspector," Carter repeated. "I looked him up after we brought him in. He's worked on civil rights cases all over the country, investigating police misconduct, no less. And he's got connections. Important ones." For the first time that day, Doyle's confidence cracked. His face turned a deep shade of red as he processed the implications. Marcus Davis wasn't just a random man Doyle could intimidate and humiliate. He was someone with power, someone who would fight back. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Doyle snapped, glaring at Carter as if the rookie had somehow caused the problem. "I tried," Carter said defensively. "You wouldn't." "Listen." Doyle stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. "Get him out of the cage," he barked, already storming toward the back lot. "Now." Outside, the crowd had nearly doubled in size. Reporters, community organizers, and concerned residents now lined the chain-link fence, their voices rising in anger as they shouted questions and calls for justice. Marcus, standing inside the cage with his arms folded across his chest, could hear their chants growing louder. "Free him! Free him!" The evening sun cast a golden glow over the scene, and from where he stood, Marcus could see Erin Langford again, her camera snapping away as she captured every detail. She gave him a small nod of encouragement, mouthing the words, "We've got you." The side door to the precinct swung open suddenly, and Doyle emerged, his face twisted into a mix of frustration and forced calm. Behind him trailed Carter, his expression one of quiet shame. Doyle approached the cage, fishing a set of keys from his belt as he sneered at Marcus. "This circus ends now. You're free to go." The crowd erupted into cheers as Doyle unlocked the cage door and yanked it open. Marcus stepped out, his movements measured and dignified despite the discomfort in his aching limbs. He straightened his back and rolled his shoulders as if to shake off the hours of confinement. "This doesn't fix what you've done," Marcus said, his voice carrying above the noise. "You can't erase what happened here today." Doyle leaned in, his tone low and venomous. "You got what you wanted, a show. Don't think this makes you special." Marcus smiled faintly, his calm demeanor only further unraveling Doyle's composure. "You'll see just how special this becomes. Today wasn't a show, it was a lesson." Before Doyle could respond, Marcus turned away, walking toward the crowd that eagerly opened to let him through. Hands reached out to pat his back and shake his hand. People called out words of support. "We're with you, Marcus. Make them pay for this. Thank you for standing up." Erin Langford rushed to meet him, microphone in hand and a cameraman at her side. "Mr. Davis," she called breathlessly. "Do you have a statement? The whole city is watching." Marcus paused, turning to face her. The camera light blinked red, recording every second. "Yes," he said clearly, his voice steady and powerful. "What happened here today is a symptom of a larger problem, a problem that's been ignored for far too long. I was targeted, humiliated, and detained unlawfully for crossing an empty street. But this isn't just about me. This is about accountability. It's about every person who's ever been victimized by a broken system. And let me be clear, there will be consequences." His words drew a roar of approval from the crowd. The camera panned to the onlookers, their faces resolute, their anger channeled into a shared purpose. As Marcus moved toward the street, reporters followed, eager for more answers. Doyle watched. From the edge of the lot, his fists clenched at his sides. He could already see the writing on the wall, this wasn't going away quietly. His actions were going to be scrutinized, his authority questioned, and his career very likely derailed. That night, news of Marcus Davis's ordeal dominated every major outlet. Photos of him in the cage circulated across television screens and news websites, accompanied by headlines that sent shockwaves across the nation. Human rights inspector detained by police in shocking abuse of power. Man placed in cage for jaywalking, public demands accountability. Federal investigation launched into police misconduct. The video of Marcus's statement had already amassed millions of views online. Celebrities tweeted in support, activists organized protests, and legal experts weighed in on the egregiousness of the incident. Marcus's calm and dignified response only added to the gravity of the story, his words resonating with anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of unchecked authority. Meanwhile, inside his modest apartment, Marcus sat quietly with a cup of tea, his phone buzzing endlessly with calls and messages. He ignored most of them, choosing instead to focus on the weight of what lay ahead. This was no longer just about his arrest. It had become a spark, a catalyst for change. And Marcus, having spent years fighting systemic injustice, knew exactly what needed to happen next. The storm had begun, and it would not be easily silenced. The reckoning. Morning broke over the city like a roar. It was no longer just another sunrise, it marked the dawn of something more profound, change. The events of the previous day had rippled far beyond a quiet neighborhood and an empty street. By now, Marcus Davis's face was on every television channel, every smartphone, and every newspaper headline across the country. From corporate offices to street corners, people debated and condemned what had happened in that rusted cage. The precinct, which had once operated with quiet impunity, was now surrounded by protesters. They came in waves, young, old, black, white, all standing shoulder to shoulder in solidarity. The roar of their chants echoed like thunder. No justice. No peace. Dismantle the abuse of power. Free the streets. Free the people. Marcus stood at the front of the crowd, flanked by local community leaders and organizers. He hadn't planned to become the face of a movement, but that's what happens when you refuse to bow to injustice. Dressed in a sharp suit, his calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the boiling energy around him. Beside him stood Erin Langford, who now played the dual role of journalist and witness. Inside the precinct, Sergeant Doyle stared at the throng of people beyond the windows. The noise was relentless. He paced the break room like a caged tiger, chewing on his fingernails, his once confident scowl replaced with frantic uncertainty. Around him, officers murmured nervously. The captain had already arrived, a stern man with graying temples and deep lines on his face. He was not happy. "You brought a storm down on this department, Doyle," the captain growled as he sat at the break room table, his voice calm but icy. "A national storm. Do you know who Marcus Davis is? The Justice Department does. And now? Now the whole damn world does." Doyle slammed his fist on the table. "It's being blown out of proportion. It's just some jaywalking nonsense. It's not jaywalking anymore, the captain shot back, his tone razor-sharp. You humiliated a man, a federal human rights inspector, of all people, and violated multiple procedures in the process. There's no covering this up. From the hallway, Officer Carter lingered just out of view, listening to the exchange with growing unease. He'd spent the night replaying the events over and over in his mind, Marcus's composed defiance, Doyle's aggression, and the cage. It gnawed at him like a splinter under the skin. Carter had joined the force to help people, but what he'd witnessed yesterday was not justice, it was cruelty. Outside, the energy of the crowd hit a fever pitch as more activists and reporters arrived. A microphone stand had been set up at the edge of the protest, where Marcus was preparing to address the crowd. The hum of anticipation stilled as he stepped forward. "Good morning," Marcus began, his voice steady and amplified through the speakers. The crowd quieted to a respectful hush, hanging on to every word. What happened yesterday was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that we've allowed to fester for too long. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We have systems built on prejudice, power, and abuse. Yesterday, I was arrested for crossing an empty street. I was caged like an animal, for no reason other than to strip me of my dignity. But here's the thing, they failed. Because dignity is not something that can be taken away by handcuffs or bars. It lives here. Marcus tapped his chest. In each of us. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, punctuated by applause. Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a witness. A witness to the truth. This moment isn't about me, it's about all of us. It's about every person who has been mistreated, overlooked, or silenced. And it's about what we're going to do about it. The crowd roared in agreement, fists punching the sky. Marcus raised his voice over the cheers. We demand accountability. Accountability for those in power who abuse their positions. Accountability for broken systems that allow injustice to thrive. And accountability for every act of humiliation that's been swept under the rug. At this, the crowd erupted, a wave of sound so powerful it seemed to shake the ground. Reporters leaned forward, their cameras capturing every word, every fist raised in solidarity. This precinct, this department, this country, has to reckon with its failures, Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping over the mass of faces. And I promise you this, they will. The energy in the air was electric. People chanted Marcus's name as he stepped away from the microphone. Leaders and activists clapped him on the back, their faces alight with determination. They were ready to fight. Inside the precinct, the noise outside was deafening. Doyle sat in the captain's office, sweat beading on his forehead as the captain scrolled through his phone, reading aloud one headline after another. Federal investigation launched into police misconduct. Human rights inspector vows justice after arrest. Local protesters demand accountability in police abuse case. You're done, Doyle, the captain said finally, setting his phone down. You're suspended, pending a full investigation. And don't think this ends here, there'll be hearings, maybe a lawsuit. Marcus Davis isn't going to let this go. Doyle's face turned scarlet. It's not fair. I was just. You were just abusing your authority, the captain snapped, cutting him off. Get out of my sight. Doyle rose, muttering curses under his breath, and stormed toward the back lot where everything had unraveled the day before. There, standing near the rusted cage, he spotted Officer Carter. The rookie officer was staring at the empty cage, his expression haunted. Doyle sneered, his anger now directed at the younger man. You proud of yourself, Carter? You helped this happen. Carter turned, his face pale but resolute. No, Sarge. You did this. All of it. And it's about time someone held you accountable. Doyle froze, stunned into silence. Carter walked past him, leaving him alone in the yard where the echoes of Marcus's calm defiance still lingered. As the sun began to set, Marcus sat at a table in the community center surrounded by his allies, lawyers, organizers, and advocates who were strategizing the next steps. "They've already started the internal investigation," one of his lawyers reported, flipping through a stack of papers. "The DOJ's involved now, and with all this media coverage, there's no sweeping it under the rug." "Good," Marcus said firmly, sipping from a glass of water. "We need to keep the pressure up. This isn't just about Doyle, this is about the entire system. We need reforms." An organizer chimed in. "The protests are only getting bigger. People are fired up, Marcus. They see you as a leader." Marcus shook his head gently. "This isn't about me. It's about all of us. I'm just here to hold the line." He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion tugging at his shoulders. It had been a long day, one that had tested his spirit and resolve, but the battle was far from over. Marcus knew the hardest part was still to come, taking this momentum and turning it into real, lasting change. Outside, the chants continued, echoing through the streets and bouncing off buildings like a heartbeat, steady, unrelenting, alive. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. No justice, no peace. The words were no longer just a chant, they were a promise. And he intended to keep it. The turning point. The following weeks unfolded like a tidal wave, sweeping across the city and beyond. Marcus Davis's ordeal had lit a spark, and what followed was nothing short of revolutionary. The protests grew larger by the day, turning into organized marches, vigils, and town halls. People came from neighboring cities, bringing banners emblazoned with messages of justice and reform. Activists from across the country joined the cause, standing shoulder to shoulder with the community. News outlets ran feature after feature on Marcus's story, not just because of its shock value, but because of what it represented. The image of him standing tall inside that rusted cage became a symbol, a grim but powerful metaphor for systemic abuse, one that resonated with millions. Inside Marcus's modest office at the community center, a whiteboard covered with notes and action plans dominated the wall. Reports and petitions littered his desk, and a large team of volunteers worked tirelessly, answering phone calls and coordinating events. Marcus sat in the center of it all, calm yet determined, his presence like a lighthouse guiding the movement forward. A knock on the door broke his concentration. Erin Langford stepped in, her camera bag slung over her shoulder, a notebook tucked under her arm. Her face was lit with the energy of someone chasing a story that mattered. "Hope I'm not interrupting," she said with a smile. "Not at all," Marcus replied, leaning back in his chair. "What do you have for me?" Erin took a seat across from him, pulling out her notebook. "Two things. First, I just got confirmation that the Department of Justice will hold a formal inquiry into Sergeant Doyle and the precinct's handling of the incident. This goes beyond just the cage. People are coming forward with complaints, other cases of harassment, bias, and abuse." Marcus's brow lifted slightly. "Good. It's about time." "It's big, Marcus," Erin continued, flipping to another page. "And second, well, you're not going to believe this. Doyle resigned this morning. Effective immediately." Marcus sat up straighter. "Resigned? Just like that?" "Just like that," Erin confirmed, a mix of satisfaction and curiosity in her tone. "Of course, it's not really voluntary. Sources say the pressure from the protests, the media, and the DOJ made it impossible for him to stay. The department's distancing itself from him to save face." Marcus allowed himself a small nod of approval. "The system protects its own until it's forced not to." Erin studied him carefully for a moment, her voice softening. "You've become a symbol, you know. People see you as a leader of something much bigger. How do you feel about that?" Marcus exhaled slowly, as if weighing her words. "I never asked for this," he admitted. "I never wanted to be the face of a movement. But when the system tries to strip you of your dignity, when it throws you in a cage for no reason other than to remind you of your place, you realize you can't stay silent. Not anymore." He paused, looking directly at Erin. "I don't see myself as a leader. I see myself as someone holding up a mirror, forcing people to look at what they'd rather ignore. Aaron nodded, scribbling notes as Marcus continued. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a culture of power that's gone unchecked. Doyle resigned, but there are hundreds of Doyles out there, hidden behind badges and bureaucracies. That's what we're fighting. The DOJ investigation moved swiftly, propelled by the intense media scrutiny and public pressure. In the days that followed, a wave of revelations poured out of the precinct. Several officers came forward anonymously, exposing misconduct, falsified reports, and patterns of racial bias that had plagued the department for years. These testimonies painted a damning picture, one that was impossible for city officials to ignore. Marcus's legal team, bolstered by allies from national civil rights organizations, filed lawsuits against the city and the department. They demanded sweeping reforms, independent oversight committees, mandatory bias training, body cameras, and an end to punitive policing practices that disproportionately targeted marginalized communities. In City Hall, officials scrambled to respond, forced to acknowledge the urgency of the crisis. Public hearings were scheduled, with Marcus and other community leaders invited to testify. The day of the hearing was a spectacle in itself. Crowds lined the steps of City Hall, holding signs and chanting as Marcus walked inside, flanked by his legal team. Reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward him. "Mr. Davis, what outcome are you hoping for today?" one reporter asked. Marcus stopped, turning toward the press with a steady gaze. "We're not here for words or empty promises. We're here for change. Real, systemic change that ensures no one, no matter their race, status, or background, is ever caged, humiliated, or violated like I was." Inside the chamber, the tension was palpable. Rows of officials sat at long tables, flanked by lawyers and advisors. At the center stood Marcus, unshaken as he delivered his testimony. "The cage they put me in wasn't an accident. It was a choice to strip me of my humanity, to send a message that I was less than," Marcus began, his voice echoing across the room. But their message backfired. Because that cage has become a symbol of everything we need to change. He outlined the systemic issues, citing statistics, testimonies, and specific reforms. His words carried the weight of truth and experience, his calm delivery magnifying their impact. By the time he finished, the room was silent, the officials visibly moved by his testimony. After a beat, the chairperson spoke. "Mr. Davis, on behalf of this council, I want to thank you for your courage. Your story has made it clear that change is not only needed, it's long overdue." In the days that followed, victory began to take shape. The city announced a slate of reforms, including independent oversight for all use of force complaints, body cameras for every on-duty officer, with mandatory footage reviews, policies to end punitive arrests for minor infractions like jaywalking, community policing initiatives to rebuild trust between officers and neighborhoods. National outlets hailed it as a turning point, a rare example of accountability leading to tangible change. But for Marcus, it was only the beginning. On a quiet evening, weeks later, Marcus stood once again in the back lot of the precinct. The cage had been dismantled, its rusted bars removed piece by piece and sent to a local scrapyard. In its place, the ground had been cleared, a small but symbolic victory. Erin joined him, her camera slung across her chest. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said softly. "How much this place has come to mean." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty patch of earth. "This place was built to break people. But instead, it made us stronger." He turned toward Erin, a faint smile playing on his lips. "The fight isn't over. It never is. But we've shown what happens when people stand together. No one can take that away." Erin raised her camera, snapping a photo of Marcus standing where the cage once stood, unbowed, resolute, free. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the city around them buzzed with life. Marcus knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but he was ready. Because dignity, justice, and change were worth fighting for, no matter how long it took. And in the hearts of those who had stood with him, the words continued to echo. No justice, no peace,